It started like every summer vacation, the kind of trip young couples dream about when they want to get away from the noise of everyday life. In July of 1993, James and Emily Carter arrived in the sleepy coastal town of Merritt's Bay, Maine, a place known more for its clifftop lighthouses and quiet charm than for anything remotely thrilling or dangerous. The beach house they rented was tucked at the edge of a small private lane, partially hidden by dune grass and weathered white fences. It wasn't fancy. In fact, it was the simplicity of it that drew them in. The salt-stained shingles, the creaky porch swing, and the scent of the sea carried in through every open window promised the peaceful retreat they were hoping for. Locals remembered James and Emily vividly, even after so many years. They stood out, not because they were flashy, but because they seemed so in love. James, a teacher by profession, always carried a well-worn leather journal tucked under his arm. Emily, who worked as a freelance illustrator, was rarely seen without a sketchpad in hand. The two spent their mornings walking barefoot on the shore, their laughter carried on the wind. In the afternoons, they'd pick up fresh fruit from the little general store or browse the quaint seaside bookstore that had been run by the same elderly couple for decades. Evenings were for long talks on the porch, wine glasses in hand, while the sun melted behind the waves in hues of orange and lavender. They'd only booked the house for 2 weeks, but by the end of the first, the Carters had become familiar faces to the handful of locals who lived in Merritt's Bay year-round. They were always kind, always smiling, and never in a rush. They asked about the town's history, visited the old lighthouse, and even attended a small community bonfire on the beach. To everyone who met them, they seemed grounded, genuine, and happy. But then, without warning, they were gone. It was a sunny Monday morning when the town's only housekeeper, a woman named Martha who came once a week to check on the rental, arrived to find the beach house eerily quiet. The screen door was gently swinging open in the breeze. At first, she thought perhaps the couple had gone for a morning stroll or decided to explore nearby towns. But as she stepped inside, something felt off. Their luggage was still neatly placed near the bedroom. Their toothbrushes were still by the sink. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle sat on the living room table. There was fresh food in the fridge and 2 coffee mugs in the sink, one still with a ring of cream at the bottom, as if the person had left mid-sip. And the car. It was still parked outside in the driveway, untouched, just where it had been since the day they arrived. It was as if the couple had simply vanished into thin air. Martha contacted the rental agency, who then called the local police. Within hours, a full-scale investigation had begun. Officers canvassed the area, speaking to anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. But there were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, no blood, no signs of struggle, and no indication that James or Emily had planned to leave. Their wallets and IDs were found in a drawer. Emily's sketchpad was open on the porch table, the last drawing showing an incomplete sketch of the waves. The town was stunned. A place as quiet as Merritt's Bay hadn't seen a missing persons case in decades, and the sudden disappearance of such a visible, friendly couple sparked fear and speculation among the residents. Rumors began to swirl. Some said the couple had drowned in the ocean, swept away by a rogue wave. Others whispered about foul play, even though the evidence didn't support it. There were stranger theories too. People who believed the house was cursed, or that something dark hid in the dunes beyond. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Search teams scoured the surrounding beaches and woods. Drones were flown overhead, and nearby towns were contacted. Their faces appeared on local news and missing posters. A hotline was set up for tips, but nothing came. No one had seen them since the Saturday night bonfire, where they'd been laughing and roasting marshmallows with the neighbors. By Sunday morning, they were gone. Detectives dug into their backgrounds but found nothing alarming. No enemies, no mental health concerns, no debts or disputes. They were a normal couple in love, enjoying their vacation, which only made the disappearance more baffling. Eventually, with no leads, no physical evidence, and no confirmed sightings, the case went cold. The beach house was closed for the season. Time passed. The locals stopped talking about the Carters as often, but the mystery never truly faded. It became a kind of legend whispered at late-night gatherings or told to children as a spooky tale. The story of the nice young couple who disappeared without a trace. The case that no one could solve. Over the years, the beach house remained vacant more often than not. People claimed to hear strange noises. Footsteps on the porch, faint music playing from inside, even laughter in the middle of the night. A few adventurous tourists rented it, hoping for a thrill or to experience the paranormal. But most left early. Some said the house had a heaviness to it. Others reported vivid nightmares during their stay. Still, nothing concrete ever emerged. No one could say with certainty what happened to James and Emily Carter that summer in 1993. Their families held memorials. The police kept the case file open. But without new evidence, the mystery remained just that, a mystery. And so, the town of Merritt's Bay carried on, forever shadowed by the quiet tragedy of two lives that simply disappeared. After the disappearance of James and Emily Carter, the beach house was no longer just another rental property. It became something different entirely. For nearly a decade, it sat untouched, its windows shuttered, its porch slowly warping from sea salt and time. Grass grew tall around the edges of the lot. The cheerful white paint began to peel, and the swing on the front porch, once a symbol of summer calm, creaked loudly in the wind like a warning no one quite understood. The locals stopped walking past it if they could help it. The children, who once rode bikes down the quiet lane, began taking the long way around. To the people of Merritt's Bay, the house was cursed. It started with whispers, nothing official, nothing spoken too loudly. Just hushed exchanges in the aisles of the general store, or cautious comments made over coffee at the local diner. There was something unnatural about a place that could swallow two healthy, happy people without a trace. It wasn't just eerie, it was wrong. The beach was supposed to be safe, peaceful. This wasn't a city where danger lurked in alleyways. This was a place where people left their doors unlocked and borrowed sugar from their neighbors. But that sense of security had vanished along with the Carters. Still, time does what it always does. It moved on. 5 years after the couple's disappearance, a new family arrived to try their luck. They were from out of state. A couple with 3 young children who had never heard the stories, or perhaps chose not to believe them. The house had been discounted heavily, and they saw it as an opportunity. A fixer-upper with a view of the sea. They lasted 3 nights. At first, it was small things. The wife noticed that their youngest daughter, just 5 years old, kept waking up in the middle of the night, saying someone was whispering in her ear. The husband brushed it off as nerves or nightmares, but then he started hearing things too. Footsteps down the hallway when everyone else was asleep. A cold breeze through the hallway with no windows open. On the 3rd night, the couple said they both woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of a woman sobbing faintly from beneath the floorboards. They packed up before dawn and never returned. When they told the realtor, she didn't act surprised. In fact, she quietly admitted that they weren't the first to leave early. But officially, no one had ever said anything was wrong. There was no paperwork for ghosts, just silence and slashed prices. As the years passed, the house became known by a name that wasn't on any legal document, but that everyone in town used: the Vanishing House. It didn't take long for the house's reputation to spread beyond Merritt's Bay. Ghost hunters and paranormal thrill seekers started showing up, hoping to capture something. An EVP, a shadow figure, or even just a feeling. Some brought cameras. A few stayed overnight. Most left disappointed. Others left shaken and refused to talk about what they'd experienced. One man, a self-proclaimed psychic from New York, claimed he felt an overwhelming sadness buried in the walls, as though the house itself remembered what had happened and couldn't let go. Despite several renovation attempts, no one stayed longer than a month. Owners came and went. Some bought the house intending to flip it, thinking the rumors were nothing more than small-town superstition. But every attempt to revitalize the property ended in frustration or unease. Contractors would report strange accidents. Tools would go missing. Lights would flicker even after rewiring. One painter quit after he claimed he saw someone staring at him from the second-story window, only to find the house completely empty when he went to check. A developer once proposed tearing the house down and rebuilding a modern vacation rental in its place. The plan was met with resistance, not from the town, but from the house itself. 3 days into the demolition planning, the site foreman fell from the roof and broke his leg. The paperwork for the permits mysteriously went missing, twice. Equipment failed. Workers refused to return. The developer eventually gave up, muttering something about bad energy, and left town without ever breaking ground. Throughout it all, the mystery of James and Emily Carter never faded. Their disappearance had become part of the house's identity, woven into its walls, its shadows, and its silence. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with unanswered questions. Every gust of wind through the broken shutters felt like a whisper of unfinished stories. People began reporting strange occurrences even from the outside. A mail carrier once said she saw a silhouette in the window upstairs, though no one was supposed to be living there. A group of teenagers who dared each other to sneak in one night claimed to hear the sound of someone humming softly in the dark, followed by a door slamming shut upstairs, even though all the doors had been removed years ago during a renovation that never finished. And yet, for all the rumors, no physical evidence of anything sinister was ever found. No blood, no signs of a break-in, no bodies, just a house that refused to feel like a home. A house that somehow always felt like it was watching. Some residents believed the place was haunted by guilt, the lingering energy of lives interrupted, of stories never told. Others believed something more tangible had happened, that someone knew more than they let on, that the answer had always been nearby, buried beneath silence and fear. But the house never gave up its secrets. By the early 2000s, it had become an icon of unresolved grief and mystery. College students wrote papers about it. Journalists pitched documentaries. Still, the house stood alone, salt-worn and windswept, daring anyone to come closer. And in all that time, through owners, renters, builders, and investigators, no one ever found out what truly happened on that warm July morning in 1993, when James and Emily Carter vanished without a trace. No one. That is, until 30 years later. In 2023, exactly 30 years after James and Emily Carter vanished without a trace, the case caught the attention of a true crime documentary crew working on a new series titled America's Most Haunting Cold Cases. The project had been greenlit by a major streaming platform, and the producers were determined to feature real stories with genuine mystery. Cases where questions still lingered like fog that refused to lift. The vanishing house in Merritt's Bay was at the top of their list. The team arrived quietly in early September, at the tail end of tourist season, when the beaches were empty and the air had a crispness that hinted at fall. Their setup was modest. A producer, 2 camera operators, a sound tech, and a researcher who had been digging through old police records and local news clippings for weeks. From the moment they arrived, there was an air of tension, not from the crew, but from the locals. The townspeople watched from porches and windows as the vans pulled up and parked in front of the old house. No one said anything directly, But it was clear that the documentary crew had stirred something that had long been kept buried beneath silence and time. The house looked almost exactly as it had in the 90s, except more weathered. The paint was dull and peeling, the roof sagging in places. Weeds had pushed their way up through the stone path, and one of the porch steps had collapsed inward. Still, the structure held, like it was waiting. Inside, the air was stale and cold, even though the sun outside was still warm. The walls carried the scent of damp wood and something else, an odor the crew couldn't quite place. Something metallic, something old. They spent the first 2 days shooting wide shots of the exterior, drone footage over the beach, and interviews with townspeople. Many declined to speak on camera, but a few braver souls agreed to share their memories. An older woman recalled seeing James and Emily walking hand in hand along the shore the night before they vanished. A former town deputy, now retired, admitted the case had haunted him for decades. Everyone repeated the same thing. The couple had simply disappeared. No struggle, no goodbye, just gone. On the third day, they moved inside. It was one of the cameramen, a 28-year-old named Marco, who first noticed something odd while filming a slow pan across the basement. The space was small, mostly used for storing cleaning supplies and old tools by past tenants. The floor was uneven concrete, the walls lined with aged wood and stone. As Marco framed a moody low-angle shot, he noticed a strange chill along the far wall. At first, he thought it was just the dampness of the basement, but then he held up his hand and felt a distinct draft, as if air was leaking through a tiny crack. He stepped closer. The wall in question looked no different from the others. Rough wood paneling, some spiderwebs, a few rusty nails. But the layout didn't match the floor plan they had been given. According to the original blueprints, which the crew had secured from the town archives, the basement should have ended about 3 feet sooner. There was space behind that wall, space that shouldn't exist. Marco called the producer over. Together, they examined the area, tapping the panels and pressing their ears to the wood. When they knocked, the sound on that side was hollow. They reached out to a local contractor and a team with ground-penetrating radar. The contractor arrived later that evening with his scanner, curious but skeptical. He'd worked on dozens of old homes, and hidden spaces weren't unusual in buildings from that era. But what the radar showed was far from normal. Behind the wall, about 3 feet deep, there was what appeared to be a small crawl space, sealed off, with no access point, no records, and no clear purpose. And at the center of the crawl space was a solid, rectangular object. The crew was stunned. The next morning, they received permission from the current property owner to remove part of the wall. The contractor carefully dismantled the paneling, exposing the old wood beneath. Behind it was a crumbling stone barrier, covered in dust and cobwebs. After clearing the debris, they uncovered a small, narrow opening, just big enough for someone to crawl through. No one spoke for several seconds. Marco volunteered to go in first, strapping a GoPro to his head and holding a flashlight in one hand. He squeezed through the opening slowly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through decades of darkness. The air was thick, musty, and heavy with something he couldn't describe, something ancient. Then, at the far end of the crawl space, he found it, a rusted metal box. It was roughly the size of a toolbox, discolored from years of moisture and decay. The surface was flaking, the latch barely intact. Marco called out, and the rest of the crew gathered around as he slid the box carefully toward the opening. When they brought it into the light, no one moved. No one dared to open it without documenting every detail. They set up 3 cameras, rolled audio, and recorded the entire process. The box creaked as the latch gave way. Inside, they found what appeared to be old photographs, black and white Polaroids, faded and scratched. A few showed the beach. Others showed the interior of the house as it once was, brighter, filled with color and life. Then came something that stopped everyone cold. A photograph of James and Emily, seated together at the dining table, looking directly at the camera. But the image had something disturbing. In the background, in the shadows near the hallway, there was a blurry figure. Too tall, too gaunt, and too distorted to be anyone they could identify. Beneath the photos was a wedding ring, dull with age. And under that, folded neatly in a sealed plastic bag, was a handwritten letter. It was addressed to whoever finds this. When authorities finally opened the rusted box recovered from the sealed crawlspace, they approached it with quiet reverence. Everyone in the room understood instinctively that what was inside could change everything. A detective wearing gloves gently lifted each item one by one and laid them on a black velvet cloth atop a fold-out table brought in for evidence handling. The first items were the photographs already reviewed by the documentary crew. Faded Polaroids, some barely legible, others disturbingly clear. But it was what lay beneath those photos that turned this from a bizarre rediscovery into a case file that would soon be reopened nationwide. They found a simple gold wedding band. It was small, likely belonging to Emily. The ring was dull with age, the engraving inside worn nearly smooth from years of pressure and moisture. Yet under angled lighting, the letters EMC, Emily Marie Carter, were still faintly visible. It was a heartbreaking object, the kind of item that says everything and nothing all at once. A symbol of life, of love, and now of loss. Then came two folded sheets of paper, each carefully preserved in separate plastic bags, likely placed there in the hope that someone someday would find them intact. Both were labeled with the same hand, a delicate cursive across the top of each page that read simply, "To whoever finds this." Investigators opened the first one. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, flowing, careful, yet rushed in places. And from the first sentence, it was obvious. It had been written by Emily Carter. Her words pulled the room into a hush. Officers who had seen everything from murders to trafficking cases stood with arms crossed, brows furrowed, as the letter was read aloud by one of the senior detectives. She began by describing a thunderstorm, the kind that rolled in fast and heavy from the Atlantic, battering the coastline and cutting power to the house late one night during their second week at the beach rental. She and James had lit candles and tried to make the best of it. The house had always creaked, she noted, but that night the sounds were different, more deliberate. They heard what they thought were footsteps in the basement. James, thinking maybe it was a loose panel or animal sheltering from the storm, grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. Emily followed a few minutes later. That's when they noticed a draft coming from the wall, one they hadn't noticed before. The letter explained how, behind a small cabinet bolted into the foundation, they discovered a narrow gap in the stone. It wasn't obvious at first, just a trick of shadow and wind. But once they moved the cabinet and scraped away some of the drywall, they uncovered a small crawlspace that hadn't been part of the original floor plan. Emily wrote that at first they were fascinated. It felt like stumbling upon a forgotten piece of the house's history. Maybe it had been a storm shelter or old storage area. But the deeper they looked, the less logical it became. Inside the crawlspace were signs of recent habitation, crumbled food wrappers, a canteen, what looked like a threadbare sleeping bag rolled tightly in the corner. There were even footprints in the dust, fresh ones. Whoever had been living there hadn't been gone long. That's when the fear began to take root. They didn't call the police immediately. Emily wrote that James was hesitant, thinking perhaps it was a transient or a teenager playing a prank. But she felt it in her bones. Something wasn't right. Things escalated quickly after that. She described how the house began to feel different, heavier. Cold spots developed in areas that had always been warm. Their personal belongings began to disappear or move. James found his journal open one morning. Pages he hadn't written on now filled with sentences in handwriting neither of them recognized. And then, The whispers began. At night, especially during storms, they heard voices. Not full conversations, just murmurs. Sometimes the same phrase over and over again. Emily began writing everything down, trying to make sense of it, trying to catalog the madness in case someone ever came looking. By the time she wrote the second letter, she was desperate. Her sentences were shorter, more frantic. She described how James had become increasingly paranoid, pacing the house at night with a hammer in his hand. He told her he was being watched, even when no one else was around. He stopped sleeping. She found him once standing motionless at the window for 2 hours, just staring out at the dunes as rain poured around him. When she asked what he was looking for, he only said, "He's waiting." Then came the revelation that shook the investigators and documentary crew alike. Emily wrote, "We thought we were alone in this house, but we were wrong. He's been here longer than us, hiding beneath the floor, watching us when we sleep, listening to everything. I don't know who he is, or what he wants, but he won't let us leave. He's locked the doors. The phone doesn't work anymore. James says it's the caretaker." Caretaker. That word stopped everyone cold. It wasn't a title anyone had seen in any official capacity related to the property. No rental agreements. No local registry. No police report ever mentioned a caretaker in connection with the house. But Emily wrote about him as if he were real, tangible, present. Someone who didn't just know the house, but controlled it. The final lines of the letter were barely legible. The handwriting trembled, the ink smudged in places. It was as if she had written it quickly in panic. "He's watching us. We can't leave. He says the house chose us. Please, if anyone finds this, don't trust the caretaker." And that was the end. No signature. No date. Just silence where the next sentence should have been. The room was filled with a deep, unsettled quiet when the letter was read. Everyone had the same thought. There had never been a caretaker listed in any documents tied to the home. None of the former owners recalled hiring anyone. The property management firm that handled seasonal rentals in the 90s had long since dissolved. But the remaining records didn't mention any live-in staff or service worker. And yet, Emily's account was specific. Personal. Terrified. One of the officers, a grizzled detective who had been with the department for over 30 years, muttered what everyone else was thinking. Then who the hell was living in that crawl space? The case, once cold and buried, had just opened its eyes. After the discovery of the letters and the chilling mention of a caretaker, no one could account for. The investigation into James and Emily Carter's disappearance reignited with a new urgency. Detectives and federal investigators combed through what little documentation remained from 1993, looking for any overlooked detail that might explain who had been watching the couple, who had been hiding within the walls of the house. That was when a name surfaced, almost by accident. In a dusty box of property records stored in the town's courthouse basement, an officer found an original deed to the beach house dated back to the 1970s. The listed owner was a man named Walter Griggs, an eccentric known to locals as a reclusive old man who rarely left his home and spoke even less. He had died in 1991, 2 years before the Carters arrived. Most people in Merritt's Bay remembered him as a quiet but harmless loner who had inherited the beach house from his parents and lived there year-round, mostly out of sight. But there was something odd about the file. A single slip of paper tucked into the back of the folder listed 2 names under property inheritance: Walter Griggs and someone named Vincent Griggs. No one in the town ever remembered hearing about a brother. Curious, the police began digging into Vincent's history, and what they found set off alarms. There were barely any records of him. No employment history, no driver's license, no medical records, no bank accounts. His name simply vanished from the system after 1989. It was as if he had stopped existing. They found a single black and white photo attached to a public assistance file from the 1980s, grainy, barely focused, showing a lanky man with sunken eyes and long, uneven hair. He had a scar down the left side of his neck. The photo hadn't been updated in decades. With this thread in hand, the police began asking around again. This time, they weren't asking about beach rentals or the Carter couple. They were asking about Vincent Griggs. That's when the stories started to surface. One elderly neighbor, who had lived near the house for over 40 years, recalled seeing someone lurking near the dunes during storms. A man with wild hair and a hunched back, wearing the same jacket every time. Another neighbor, a retired fisherman, remembered encountering a stranger several times while walking his dog early in the mornings. Someone who disappeared into the trees before he could say a word. They described a man who didn't like to be seen. A man who never responded when spoken to. A man who watched from the shadows. Back in 1993, police had brushed these stories off. At the time, it wasn't unusual for the area to have the occasional transient drifting through, especially during tourist season. Beach towns always had their share of strange visitors, and with no crime scene, no struggle, and no sign of forced entry, they had no reason to suspect otherwise. But now, with a sealed-off crawlspace, a terrified woman's letter warning about a mysterious caretaker, and the sudden reappearance of Vincent's name, the puzzle pieces began to rearrange themselves. The new investigative team coordinated a full search of the property, including the surrounding woods, dunes, and any abandoned buildings nearby. They brought in canine units, ground-penetrating radar, and a forensic archaeology team. The area around Merritt's Bay was remote in parts, thick with scrubby brush and tangled woods. The dunes were unstable, shifting with the wind and time, and had buried many things over the years. 3 days into the search, a cadaver dog picked up a scent about a mile from the house, in a shallow gully beneath a collapsed wooden shed that had once served as a storage shelter for the nearby community. The structure was barely recognizable, half covered in sand and reeds, tilted at an angle as if it were trying to disappear into the earth. Inside, buried beneath debris and earth, they found what remained of a makeshift camp. Old canned food, decayed clothing, cigarette butts, an empty kerosene lantern, and in one corner, hidden beneath a rotting tarp, they found a disturbing collection of items. Dozens of yellowed newspapers, some dating back to the late 1980s, all featuring headlines about missing persons. Pinned to the wooden wall with rusty nails were photographs, dozens of them. Most were faded, water-damaged and torn, but a few were still clear. Some were of beachgoers, some were of children, but near the center was a large Polaroid of James and Emily Carter, standing together in front of the beach house, arms around each other. It was the same photo that had been found in the rusted box, but this one was untouched, pristine. Next to it, written in red ink, were 3 words: "They found me." The forensics team worked carefully to extract everything. But that wasn't the worst of it. Beneath a trapdoor in the floor of the shed, hidden by loose boards and a layer of sand, they found a concrete slab. It took hours to break through. Beneath it was a pit. In that pit were bones. Human bones. The lab analysis would later confirm that some of the remains were consistent with adults who had gone missing in the region over a span of nearly 15 years. Others were still unidentified. Among them were remains matching the DNA of James and Emily Carter. But there was no sign of Vincent Griggs. What disturbed investigators even more was how recent some of the artifacts were. A receipt from a local gas station dated just 2 years earlier. A broken burner phone, one that had made a single outgoing call in 2021 to a number now disconnected. A pair of shoes with barely any wear, far too new for a man supposedly dead or long gone. The implication was chilling. Vincent hadn't just lived in hiding. He had been active, possibly still was. The discovery reignited panic in the town. Patrols were increased. Drone sweeps were launched into the forested areas near the cliffs. A few locals reported seeing someone lurking near the dunes at night, but the sightings were inconsistent. Shadowy figures that vanished before they could be approached. No clear image of Vincent Griggs was ever captured. His name was entered into national databases as a person of interest in multiple cold cases. But even with all this evidence, bones, photos, letters, and objects left behind, Vincent himself remained a ghost who had once lived inside the walls of a beach house, a ghost who had possibly watched his victims for weeks before acting, and one the town would never stop fearing. Just a few hundred feet behind the beach house, where the land dipped into a shallow depression between the dunes, cadaver dogs began to bark. The search team had been combing the area for over an hour, moving methodically across the grass-covered hills and down into sandy gullies formed by decades of shifting winds and storms. The dogs, specially trained to detect the faintest trace of human decomposition, had initially shown mild interest, sniffing at tufts of grass and matted clumps of weeds. But then, almost simultaneously, two dogs veered toward the same spot. A patch of dune grass bent unnaturally, the soil beneath slightly darker than the rest. They pawed and whimpered. Then they sat, tails still, ears alert. The lead investigator called out, and within minutes, the team had cordoned off the area. They began digging slowly, carefully. The first few inches yielded only sand and compacted roots, but soon the soil changed, darker, looser, disturbed. A few more inches and the unmistakable scent of decay, even after all these years, began to rise into the air. And then they saw bone. The remains were curled, brittle, partially mummified by the cool, dry conditions of the dune. A second set of bones lay just a few feet away, also buried shallowly, as though the person who had done this had been in a hurry, or perhaps simply wanted the grave to vanish into nature, swallowed by time and salt-laced winds. Forensic teams arrived immediately. The recovery took hours, each bone documented, photographed, and carefully lifted into evidence containers. Around the remains were small, heartbreaking fragments of what had once been lives filled with promise and joy. Emily's silver locket, bent slightly, the chain rusted but intact, was still clasped around her neck. Inside was a tiny photograph, miraculously preserved, of her and James on their wedding day. Her smile was wide, radiant, forever frozen in time. James's wristwatch, cracked and filled with sand, still hung loosely from the bone of his left wrist. The time had stopped, permanently etched into the face. The hour hand rested just past midnight. And next to them, lying half-buried in the dirt as if carelessly dropped, were the keys to the beach house. Rusted through, but still clutched together by a faded blue keychain. The kind property managers often use, labeled simply, Coastal 12. But it wasn't just the remains that told a story. Near the bodies was a small camping stove, now a rusted husk. Nearby, half-crushed water bottles lay scattered, the plastic partially melted by time and heat. Wrappers from preserved food, canned beans, dried fruit, energy bars, were tucked beneath layers of sand and grass. It was the presence of those items that disturbed investigators the most. This wasn't just a burial site. It was a campsite, a prison. The implication was horrifying. James and Emily had been kept alive for days, perhaps even weeks. Trapped, fed just enough to survive. Isolated, hunted. Experts later confirmed that the remains showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. There were no immediate signs of blunt force trauma or gunshot wounds. No broken bones from a fall. The cause of death, though officially listed as undetermined due to skeletal condition, was suspected to be asphyxiation or poisoning. One forensic analyst described the situation as death by deprivation, a slow, cruel fade from existence, likely in fear, pain, and silence. Investigators scoured the area for any other signs of life. A makeshift shelter, personal belongings, a notebook, anything that might give insight into what happened in those final days. But the grave gave up nothing else. It had held its secrets for 30 years and shared only what it chose. For the Carter family, the confirmation of James and Emily's identities brought bittersweet closure. DNA analysis matched both remains within days. After decades of unanswered questions, whispers, and empty holidays, they finally knew. But the answer came with new grief. The fact that their loved ones had not simply vanished, but had suffered, possibly held hostage, buried within walking distance of the home they'd rented for peace, was almost too much to bear. Emily's sister, now in her 60s, broke down during a press conference, sobbing as she clutched the recovered locket. "They were so close," she whispered. "So close." Authorities immediately issued a renewed arrest warrant for Vincent Griggs, now officially listed as a suspect in the kidnapping and murder of James and Emily Carter. But Vincent was a ghost, untraceable. The last verifiable record of him dated back to 1989. No fingerprints, no digital trail, no recent photos. It was as though he had spent his life hiding, moving silently through the cracks of society. If he had kept the Carters trapped, it meant he had built a system for himself, a place to hide them, feed them, and eventually silence them, without anyone noticing. That level of control takes planning, experience, patience. Investigators theorized that Vincent may have lived undetected in the crawlspace for months or even years. That he had watched the Carters from the moment they arrived, choosing them. Perhaps he had once been the actual caretaker of the home when his brother owned it. Maybe he believed the house still belonged to him. Maybe he saw them as trespassers. Maybe he believed he was protecting something. Or maybe he was just a predator who had learned how to vanish in plain sight. Despite national coverage of the renewed case, age-progressed sketches, and a flurry of tips, no sign of Vincent ever surfaced. He was never seen again. No trace of him appeared in security footage, hospitals, shelters, or government systems. It was as if he had melted into the woods or the sea. But in Merritt's Bay, the fear never faded. Residents put up motion lights. The local hardware store sold out of locks and cameras. Some claimed they heard strange noises coming from the dunes late at night. A few swore they saw someone watching from the cliffs just before sundown. A gaunt figure hunched under a tattered coat. Police investigated every lead, but nothing held. And as weeks turned to months, Vincent's presence, real or imagined, became part of the town's haunted legacy. What remained behind was a pair of graves, a story half told, and a house that still stood at the edge of the coast, creaking in the wind, holding memories it refused to release. The discovery of James and Emily Carter's remains, alongside the chilling evidence of their final days, rippled far beyond Merritt's Bay. It wasn't just another cold case cracked. It was a deeply human story of love lost, of innocence stolen, and of a quiet town that had unknowingly harbored a hidden nightmare for 30 years. Within hours of the official press release, national news outlets descended on the coastal village. Headlines ran across every major platform. Missing couple found after 30 years, buried behind their vacation home. Vanishing house mystery finally solved, and perhaps most hauntingly, don't trust the caretaker. A chilling note from the grave. Journalists set up cameras outside the weathered beach house, now a crumbling relic of something darker than just salt and age. Emily's surviving family members arrived a few days later, accompanied by grief counselors and local law enforcement. They didn't speak much to reporters. What could they possibly say that hadn't already been whispered in agony behind closed doors for 3 decades? But when they finally stood at the edge of the same beach where Emily and James had once walked hand in hand, the silence was profound. The family organized a candlelight vigil, held just after sunset along the shoreline. Dozens of locals attended, many who remembered the young couple fondly from their short time in the village, others who had only known them through rumors and legends. Some brought flowers. Others brought drawings or letters. A few simply came to stand in solidarity. The sea was calm that evening, the sky streaked in soft hues of gold and lilac as the sun dipped low. Waves lapped gently at the shore as candles flickered in the breeze. A local pastor said a few words, his voice wavering as he acknowledged not only the pain but the strange sense of peace that had come with finally knowing the truth. "There are ghosts that don't haunt houses," he said quietly, "but live instead in the hearts of those left behind. And tonight, we set them free." James and Emily were buried together in the town's cemetery, their headstones placed side by side under a young willow tree. The engravings were simple. Under James's name, a gentle heart, a steady hand. Under Emily's, she sketched the world in kindness. People came in waves to pay their respects. Even those who had once dismissed the mystery or treated the house as mere local lore now looked back with a mixture of guilt and awe. Some residents admitted they had always sensed something off about the property, but had chosen not to speak up. Others wished they had done more, asked more questions, pushed harder back when the story was still fresh. Shortly after the burial, the beach house was officially seized by the state and declared uninhabitable. The structure was boarded up. A rusted chain and padlock were placed on the gate. A weather-stained sign now hangs crookedly on the front porch. Private property. Do not enter. The town council voted unanimously to keep the house closed to the public indefinitely. Some wanted it torn down entirely, claiming it carried too much darkness. Others believed it should be preserved as a memorial, a reminder of what can happen when we ignore the warnings written in silence. For now, it simply stands gray, peeling and watching. Children still ride their bikes past it on dares. Teenagers tell stories about the caretaker, inventing outlandish tales to scare each other. Adults walk their dogs along the outer fence and glance sideways at the windows, half expecting a shadow to move behind the curtainless glass. The stories have changed, but the whispers have not. The vanishing house, as it's still called by locals, has become a part of the town's identity. An uneasy landmark in a place that once prided itself on being ordinary. Tourists pass through Merritt's Bay now, not for the seafood or the view, but to catch a glimpse of the house that hid a secret for 30 years. A few take selfies at the fence. Some bring flowers. Others just stare, quietly, as if trying to hear echoes through the wood. What truly happened in those final days before James and Emily were taken, before they were buried in a dune just steps from help, may never be fully understood. The letters Emily left behind offer glimpses: fear, confusion, isolation. But they stop short of telling us the whole truth. We don't know how long they were trapped. We don't know if they ever tried to escape. We don't know what Vincent said to them, or why he believed they had to die. But perhaps the not knowing is what makes it all the more chilling. Because this was not the kind of horror that bursts through doors or screams in the night. This was something quieter. Something that hides in the corners, behind creaky stairwells, beneath floorboards. Something that watches, waits, and chooses its moments carefully. The story of the Carters is no longer just a cold case. It's a warning. Sometimes, the most terrifying things are not hidden in the woods or in distant nightmares, but are right next to us. In our homes, in the walls, in the people we dismiss as harmless. Sometimes evil isn't loud, it's patient, and it hides in plain sight. In the weeks that followed, the documentary crew who helped uncover the truth returned to complete their series. The final episode aired under the title The House That Watched. It opened with a drone shot of the beach house, the ocean stretching endlessly behind it, and ended with Emily's final written words narrated softly over the image of 2 candles floating out to sea. "He's watching us. We can't leave. Please, if anyone finds this, don't trust the caretaker." And just like that, the credits rolled. Back in Merritt's Bay, life has slowly resumed its rhythms. The bakery opens early, the postman makes his rounds, and tourists walk the beach looking for shells. But for those who live there, who remember what happened, there's a new understanding, a new caution, because sometimes the darkest secrets aren't buried deep underground. They aren't locked in vaults or hidden in the woods. Sometimes they're much closer. Sometimes they're behind your walls.